I'm Dr. Rachel Becker, and I'm so excited to be talking today about early 19th century gendering and woodwinds. Two things before I begin. The first is that I am speaking to you from Boise, Idaho, which is on the lands of the Shoshone-Bannock people. The second thing is that I'm not recording from my office at Boise State University. I'm recording from my home where I am in COVID quarantine. So if anything unusual happens technologically, I apologize for that. So that said, let's get started. Generally, my discussion of gendering in music and of gendering in woodwind instruments more specifically begins with a clarification that things changed dramatically in the 19th century. It's somewhat thrilling, therefore, to talk a little bit about the time before that change. I've done my best to fit a little bit of many different aspects into it, featuring many historical quotations, and you are very welcome to reach out if you'd like more sources on anything particular. So let's look a little bit at gender conceptions before and during the 19th century, the gendering of instruments and their music on either side of that divide, and then at some female musicians at a time when professional musicians were absolutely expected to be male. A note, I'll often be falling into the gender binary in this talk as I attempt to concisely represent historical approaches to sex and gender. So how were woodwind instruments described in the 18th century? 18th century flautist Johann Georg Tromlitz advises that a flautist should try to achieve a steady metallic singing even sound and try to achieve only such strength as is healthy and masculine. In 1838, William Gardner described a new instrument called a clarionet. I know that's not in the 18th century, but the clarinet with its fiery tone was still better adapted to lead armies into the field of battle than the meek and feeble oboe. The early oboe, however, was majestical and stately and not much inferior to the trumpet, as well as brave and sprightly, and this characterization held during the 18th century. Schubart, writing in 1806, claims that bassoon playing demands the fullest breath and such a sound and masculine embouchure that only few people are fit physically to play it in a masterly manner. We see, I think, a trend. And this is broadly reflected in public performances. Taking merely a sample of the performances listed in the collation of some festival programs of the 18th and 19th centuries, Liverpool and Manchester, which features lists of both soloists and orchestra members, we see women appear exclusively as vocalists, not even as a harpist. A side note, significant musical names appear in these programs, including Malibran, Pasta, Dragonetti, and Garibaldi. And so what is our stereotypical idea of a historical female musician? Perhaps that reflected in this report from 1800 Vienna in the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung. Young ladies, one after the other. Each one opens up her pianoforte sonata, and who can find fault with it so long as it is regarded simply as a family entertainment? Only we mustn't consider it as a contribution to art, nor the fair participants, despite their guest compliments, as artists. On the contrary, it is this universal easy amateurism that has ruined taste and caused a sense of better things to slumber. Our prevailing image of 18th and 19th century female musicians is of the amateur playing at home, not very well, while biding time for its marriage. And yet, of course, the presence of women as performers and the status of woodwind instruments as feminine or masculine and as appropriate or inappropriate for female players is more complicated. How then do societal gender roles play into all this, and how do they change over time? Western society has certainly elevated men and masculine characteristics above women and feminine characteristics since, well, as far back as you care to go. But what is considered masculine or feminine and the way that those two descriptions are seen in relation to each other have certainly changed. The Renaissance understood bodies to fundamentally have one biological sex, with some bodies simply developing more fully than others. This positioned all people who were not grown men in one group, with femininity essentially being more childlike than masculinity. This allowed men to grow out of effeminate behaviors, but it also connected to the idea of the humors with the danger of effeminacy, a constant fear in illness. And effeminacy could also arise from the wrong kind of music. The 18th century, and forgive my temporal acceleration, was then a time of shifting understandings of gender, or rather the continuation and reinforcement of shiftings that actually began in the 17th century. By 1800, society broadly understood men and women to have two separate, distinct biological sexes. The result of this is the shift from women and femininity from being imperfect men, but fundamentally with the same potential and urges, to being entirely other and opposite to men. The 18th century then is a time of instability in gender descriptions and gender roles, and this still allowed for more flexibility and freedom than the 19th century. Masculine women, or especially feminine men, were not necessarily seen as wildly outre or at risk of falling outside of polite society. Rather, they were often seen as simply painfully modern. At the same time, as in previous centuries, this instability did introduce anxiety about a person's gender becoming unclear or illegible within society. As a side note, even well into the 19th century, we see anxiety about improving instruments through keys, through changes in bores or material, and this perhaps speaks to a lingering notion of earlier gender relations. Can we read the fear of dehumanizing instruments by removing defects as related to the idea of women as defective men? I'll simply drop that idea in and keep moving. By the time we enter the 19th century, this flexibility and freedom were greatly reduced. As Margaret Reynolds so neatly puts it in discussing 18th and 19th century opera, not all ages and cultures want to play about with gender, and 19th century Europe seems to be one of these, creating ever firmer gender roles and becoming ever less willing to counteract them. Now, how does all of this intersect with woodwind instruments? Let's begin in the 16th century with some perhaps unexpected woodcuts of female wind players. Here we see a transverse flute and a cornetto. But we also see a poem accompanying each below, and further mixed messages. Although Miss Minerva is displeased with pipes because they distort the mouth, one should not pay her heed. It is just her women's chatter. Our female player is part reality, part fashion plate, part allegory, and at the same time, we should not pay her heed. And it's apt that I describe her as part fashion plate because clothing also deeply impacts performers and impacts performers in male and female clothing differently. Even a pianist at, say, Haydn's time is restricted in their attire from close-fitting jackets to corsets. And Haydn seems to have written differently for his male and female dedicatees, especially pianists, with fewer hand crossings, for example, for women. Another idea I will largely drop in here as food for thought. Returning here, these are certainly not the only historical images of female wind players, or the only known female instrumentalists before the 18th century. And after. For example, Vivaldi wrote scores of works for girls and women of the Ospedale della Pietà, including for female bassoonists. We'll come back to him later. We do, however, see women outside of singers and to some extent pianists gradually becoming less visible over the 17th and 18th centuries, and then gradually reappearing as the 19th century winds to a close. This is related to the increasing alignment of instruments with specific characteristics and the strengthening of certain kinds of gender separations during these periods. So let's return to the descriptions of woodwind instruments before and in the 19th century as woodwinds become unabashedly feminine in their musical characteristics. We have a continual tension between real historical restrictions on female behavior and the fact that, as Elizabeth Ford puts it, thinking about women playing wind instruments in the past has been highly influenced by prudish 19th century views on femininity. Early flutes, oboes, and clarinets all featured in military bands across Europe, and early bassoons are associated with cornettian trombones. Now, the transverse flute is a different instrument than the early fife depicted in woodcuts of soldiers, but on the one hand, transverse flutes and fifes are not always clearly distinguished in language, and on the other hand, we know that in 1763, the Hessian Regiment of Life Dragoons advertised for a musician to play oboe, transverse flute, and clarinet. Menestrier writes in 1681 that if trumpets enliven the cavalry and even the horses, experience proves that hautboys make soldiers march more happily, and that in playing at festivities and even in combat, they give the effect of going off to a wedding. And hautboy bands were popular at courts and in armies across Europe. We also see continuity from a 1706 tutor for the chalumeau entitled The Complete Book for the Mock Trumpet to Hiller's opinion in 1769 that it is a rarity to notice clarinets with a prominent part in the theater orchestra. Up to now, it has perhaps only served to make tolerable the tone of a military fife and the noise of the drum. However, despite the long-lasting impact of military bands and military winds, by the 18th century, we have begun seeing both significant female gendering of instruments and a significant use of descriptors, which at the time signaled a courtly, sensitive man, but now read as feminine. Quantz writes in his famous 1752 method book that, in general, the most pleasing tone quality on the flute is that which more nearly resembles a contralt than a soprano. One must strive as much as possible to acquire the tone quality of those flute players who can draw a bright, cutting, thick, round, masculine, but also pleasing sound from the instrument. We are unlikely now, I think, to put all of those adjectives in a pool of like words. We see a similar mix in a treatise from 1771 by Buchanan. Elegance in musical performance, like gracefulness in action or motion, may be improved but cannot be given. In action, it is the native grandeur or nobility of the mind beaming forth and throwing a glory round us. In music, it is the language of the soul addressing itself to the passions, or rather, it is the sensibility of the soul describing, and as it were painting, itself to us in sound. By the time we reach the last decade of the 18th century, we have experienced a noticeable shift. In 1793, John Gunn writes in The Art of Playing the German Flute that there are two schools of playing. In one, there is an emphasis on an equal fullness of tone, the example and practice of every public performer, clearly to him, a man, I will say. And in the other, the character of the flute from its affinity to the female voice is softness, grace, and tender expression, and can by no means be the bold and warlike expression of those full and loud tones which seem to emulate the notes of the trumpet. We see, I think, in his language, his leaning towards the latter school. So the flute we see is now specifically the female voice, and here she shall stay. What we see in the 19th century is a combination of changing tastes, philosophies, and instrumental sounds, which lead not only to increasing connections between specific instruments and gendered characteristics, but also to increasing distinctions between instruments and to increasing ties between instrumental and specific compositional qualities. In periods when acceptable instrumentation in solo or chamber music often included all treble instruments from the violin to the recorder to the transverse flute to the viol, the character of the piece was separated from the character of the instrument. So the flute or the oboe could easily be seen as majestic, military, and charming by those writers. By the 19th century, we lack this instrumental flexibility on multiple fronts, and Berlioz's oboe is an instrument of naive grace, sentimental delight, or the suffering of weaker creatures. Moreover, when attempting strength or showmanship, the splutter of rage or threats or heroics, its little bittersweet voice becomes quite ineffective and absurd. We lack the flexibility. A march melody, however direct, however beautiful, however noble, loses its nobility, its directness, and its beauty when given to the oboes. Berlioz, writing in the early 1840s, was wildly influential, but not unique in his descriptions of feminine winds. At a bird's eye level, we overwhelmingly see range-based characteristics, often just an elaborate fleshing out of the literal connection between instruments and voice parts. And these show how artificial some of these associations and limitations are and how basic others are. The clarinet, for example, was associated with adaptability and a wider range of characteristics than other woodwind instruments, reflecting its literal wide range. Furthermore, although the transformations begin early in the 1800s, or even a little bit beforehand, as we've seen, descriptions of woodwind instruments after the 19th century gender switch remain very static across nearly 200 years of the 19th and 20th centuries. These remarks are also consistent across large swaths of otherwise relatively disparate Europe and in the United States. Well, that said, let's turn to some of the women who did play woodwind instruments in the 18th and 19th centuries, despite those instruments being described as too manlike. I mentioned Vivaldi's Ospedale above, and while we know few names associated with Venetian Ospedale musicians, we have copious evidence of female instrumentalists. Charles Burney wrote about his 1770 trip to Venice in a complimentary but highly gendered way. I must likewise do justice to the orchestra, which is here under the most exact discipline. No one of the instrumental performers seemed ambitious of shining at the expense of the vocal part, but each was under that kind of subordination, which is requisite in a servant to a superior. Some observers, however, were less accepting of these female musicians. A female traveler reported in 1776 that when I entered, I was seized with so violent a fit of laughter that I am surprised that they had not driven me out again. You cannot wonder what my risibility was excited when upon entering the tribune, my eyes were struck with the sight of a dozen or 14 beldames, ugly and old, one blowing a French horn, another sweating at the bass viol, another playing first fiddle, and beating time with her foot in the greatest rage, others performing on bassoons, oboe, and clarionet. I could no longer bear to hear it, so much had the sight of the performers disgusted me. Descriptions of the female singers are perhaps expectedly more positive. However, we do know the names of other female instrumentalists. For example, Marion Davis was a flautist in 1750s and 60s London, where she advertised as a teacher of glass harmonica, German flute, and other instruments. She seems to have been much more well-known as a glass harmonica player, working directly with Benjamin Franklin and touring the UK and Ireland performing on that instrument. The Scottish Susanna Montgomery, Lady Eglinton, played flute in the early 1700s, and she was the dedicatee of William McGibbon's 1734 sonatas for 2 German flutes or 2 violins and a bass. We know relatively little of her specific musical activities. There's also evidence of 2 women playing flute at the Concert Spirituel in Paris in the 18th century. Mademoiselle Taillard played a flute sonata in 1735, and Mademoiselle Mudridge performed in 1779 and 1780, performing a flute concerto by Stamets. We also know of a female trumpet player, Johanna von Hoff, who played for the Emperor in Vienna in 1655, and of another, Elisabetta Schmidt, active in Württemberg in 1722. To move more closely into the woodwind quintet, horn player Signor Tonini, attached to the household of the Russian ambassador to France, performed in Paris and Vienna in the 18-teens. And Mudridge performed at the Concert Spirituel with another female hornist, Mademoiselle Corny. Clarinetist Margaret Knittel features in the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung in 1816, following a performance at a subscription concert. Her delivery is cold, her skill trifling, but she received some applause for the unusualness of seeing the instrument played by a lady. Knittel then successfully toured in the United States for 8 years while remaining active in Vienna, and she received many reviews that were more positive than that one. We know of at least 2 other early female clarinetists, the sisters Cordula Metzger and Caroline Kremer, whose instruction came from their clarinetist mother, Josefa Strasburger. Metzger performed a Kromer concerto with the Zurich Orchestra in 1811, and in 1812 was appointed principal clarinet of the newly formed Allgemeine Musikgesellschaft Zurich, performing with them until 1814. She had been employed by a previous Zurich Music Society since at least 1808, and she was the only female musician in the orchestra. Kramer, who was also an accomplished violinist, toured throughout German-speaking areas from at least 1821 to 1840 and performed until at least 1856, Weber's Concertino among many other works, including her own Fantasia. She took composition lessons from Franz Danzi and published a clarinet sonatine in 1825. She was apparently heralded as a clarinetist by Hans, I haven't found that, but I have found a few other mentions of her. We see her described actually in quite feminine terms, gentle, melting, feminine in every respect, and not using the full power of her instrument. She plays with grace and a gentle, pleasing tone. And with that, I lead you into today's concert by the Westeinde Winds, who focus on reconstructing the repertoire performed by these three clarinetists, as well as Lady Susanna Montgomery. My email is here, and as I say, you are very welcome to reach out with any questions or if you want some of my sources. I'm so thrilled to be talking to you today. Thank you very much for having me.